Yokozo to konbanwa minasan. Maven of the Eventide desu. これは Vampire Reviews です。と、吸血鬼は浅くです。Let's talk about Dracula. No, wait. Take that, flip it, reverse it. You're blowing my mind! As we all know, because I have told you multiple times, Dracula has been adapted as a character more than any other character in the history of anything ever. Any other. Ever. If you're wondering why I haven't discussed a straight adaptation of Dracula on the show yet, it's because it's such a huge subject, and he is such a huge vampire, and will be a great undertaking to do properly. But tonight, we will discuss him as he is brought to us in Helsing. There are two main vampires in Helsing, but I've already discussed Saris Victoria in my top 10 female vampires review. If you haven't watched it, go ahead. I'll wait. Obviously, I like her. She made the top 5. Though I have to admit, part of the reason I included her is because I was so miffed to find that so many people don't like her for kind of sexist reasons, and I think she's a really underrated character. There is no sense in repeating myself though, so tonight we will focus on Alucard, who is Dracula. But unlike you've ever seen Dracula before! At least when Hellsing first came out 20 years ago. For a classic Western character reinterpreted so many times by so many different cultures, it was undeniably exciting when late 90s Japan delivered a Dracula who was thoroughly unique. The manga was the brainchild of a single person producing a passion project. Kouta Hirano remarks in frequent author's notes his elation to be able to do whatever he wants with it. He was a free spirit, expressing his art with no restrictions. The originality of his work is questionable when you compare his stuff to other similar violent action manga of the time, but even though he was working in an established genre, his use of vampires, and Dracula specifically, was what set it apart. The manga ran for 11 years. But after only 3 years, an anime series was produced, then released on American television, and was instantly hugely popular with the kids. Well, more like with the bros. But this created demand for English translations of the books, and Kouta Hirano's Dracula became legend. Being created only 3 years into an 11-year manga series obviously means the anime differs greatly after its plot surpasses the released volumes of the time. Its second half is, therefore, entirely original content written by the TV producers. And there's this, split in preference among the audience. The TV anime is better known by people at large and responsible for Helsing's initial popularity, so it has a claim for being beloved. But there are also the canon purist hardcore fans who only love the books, and the other direct-to-DVD anime that was made after the manga was finished. This is Helsing Ultimate. So we have 3 properties amounting to about 13 hours of animation and about 2,000 pages. The TV anime, which was most Americans' intro and only exposure to the characters, the manga, which were written by one very passionate nerdy man, and Ultimate, the professionally produced OVA, which was faithful to, but had the budget and staff to improve upon, everything Hirano did alone. Largely, I think what's included in the animes that's not in the manga adds to the ideas. Character, nuance, emotion. And even though the production value on Ultimate is better, watching at least the first half of the TV anime really enhances what feels lacking or rushed in the first 2 episodes of Ultimate. Even though the added stuff is different in both versions, it all serves to deepen the story and characters and relationships while remaining true to the spirit of the universe. Based on what each version had to work with, it's all good, okay? Silly. Pretty silly. A lot of times, very silly. But solid. And popular. Really popular. The early 2000s saw a surge in popularity of anime in general in America, but Helsing stands out. Why? Because vampires are the best. Just kidding, I know I say that about everything, but actually, it's kind of true in this case. Here, we have a Japanese-made property about one of the most famous European stories that Westerners immediately recognize. And the American audience was all like, Dracula! I know Dracula! Yeah, Dracula! And it's set in England, featuring a cast of mostly Caucasian characters, and it's violent. Really, really violent. And if there's anything Americans love, it's white people and guns, am I right? But Hirono didn't make it for Americans. He made it for himself. He did whatever he wanted. And the manga is kind of sloppy, especially in the beginning. Not badly written or even has plot holes per se, but just loosely joined thoughts, leaps of assumption. It feels like he was just spewing out all these ideas of stuff that he just thought was cool and not thinking them through very deeply and relying on them to seem deep just by how nerdy and obscure his references were. I mean, besides the vampire lore and blood and gore, we're talking everything from religious history, to weapon design, to opera and Shakespeare, to quantum mechanics, to ancient alchemy, and his unbridled excitement and sense of fun over it all is part of the appeal. It's raw and vulnerable. We see a lot of just what makes this guy happy and excited, and readers can get swept up in that too. That, alongside his thoroughly unfiltered author's notes, makes him feel accessible. Like, he could be your friend, someone to geek out and squee with. You know, if you're willing to look past his unapologetic occasional sexist dickishness. But don't you feel smart and like you're part of some elite clique by picking up on all his nerdy, scholarly references? There's a lot I could say about all the characters and themes and ideas in this series, but we're here to talk about the vampires. Besides Saris Victoria and Alucard, there are a few others, but with the exception of one minor made up for the anime character, they're all relatively shallow villains. So, Helsing is an organization founded by Abraham Van Helsing from Dracula. You know, this guy. Van Helsing has somehow acquired this pop culture reputation for being a kick-ass vampire hunter, even though in the book he was just this old doctor who studied some stuff and had a team of strapping young men to hunt one vampire one time for him. But anyway, the Helsing organization covertly fights monsters in England. At the time of our story, it's run by Van Helsing's great-great-great-granddaughter, and it's a religious organization. Protestant Anglican Christian. Their mission is to rid England of unholy monsters, particularly vampires, and they pray a lot. But when Van Helsing defeated Dracula, you know, like he should totally get all the credit for, forget those other guys, instead of actually being destroyed, Dracula ended up working for him. And since then, Dracula's been a good vampire who kills bad vampires for the organization. The current Helsing's father renamed Dracula Alucard, and so he's been going by that name for the past generation. But here's the thing. Dracula has this reputation for being king of the vampires, which is pretty cool, but he's also had a reputation for being old-fashioned. People thought of him as the capes and coffins kind of vampire, and in the last 40 years or so, the pushback against that has been young, hip vampires who aren't like that stuffy old Dracula. Dracula is a Victorian story. Attempts to bring him as a character into the modern era and make him cool or sexy haven't gone over so well when it's been studios doing what they think young people will find cool. But Alucard is one person's passion, an expression of the author's unchecked id. He lays it all out there for consumption and enjoyment. That's why it works, as silly and ridiculous as it can be, where these don't. And he knew that you can't really have a Victorian villain be taken seriously in the modern era unless you up the ante. And boy, does he up it. Besides Alucard just being Dracula, and all the inherent clout that implies, the Helsing organization spent a century augmenting him through vague magical science alchemy means, and turned him into a creature of incalculable power. Really, he's more eldritch Lovecraftian horror now than vampire. And you know what that makes him? Awesome. And scary. But, despite having all this uncanny magical power, he just loves guns. Why? Because that's what Hirono wanted to draw. That's why. No? Okay. 'Cause he likes to fight. He likes a challenge. He just likes them, okay? They're fun for him. Every vampire needs a hobby. So we've got this unstoppable monstrous horror of phenomenal cosmic power that chooses to shoot things with guns and dress like a Victorian cowboy. Bad ass. Francis Ford Coppola's 1992 Bram Stoker's Dracula film was Hirono's chief influence for the character. Now, this was the film that cemented the pop culture trope of Dracula being literally Vlad the Impaler. Contrary to popular belief, Bram Stoker didn't actually base Dracula on Vlad the Impaler at all. He got the name from reading a history book about another Dracula who also attacked the Turks. There were a lot of voivodes named Dracula back in the day, and he liked the name because Dracula translates to devil. But there is no evidence in his copious notes that he even knew Vlad the Impaler existed. Vlad's link to Dracula was first headcanoned by scholars, like 40 years after Stoker died. But Coppola's movie did more for changing Dracula's image than the Vlad backstory. It also added emotional depth to the character. Now, that's a discussion for another day, but there's no denying the influences that aspect of the film had on Alucard as well. And the touchy-feely stuff is the key to what makes him such a beloved character. For something so focused on coolness and badassery, Helsing has some impressively complex ideas about the nature of vampires and humanity. Like back to his love of guns. Why use them when he can turn into a giant eyeball monster and just consume things whole? No, it's not just a hobby. It goes much deeper. See, you run into a problem when you create such a powerful character. How to have fun with it without it turning into a boring Godmod Mary Sue situation. Hirano's treatment of it is interesting in that he makes this Alucard's personal dilemma, not just a storytelling dilemma. Because, in part, yes, he does want to have fun doing his job, and easy victories are no fun for him.
You can't even defend yourself. You dare to call yourself Nosferatu? You disgust me.
The Bird of Hermes catchphrase sums up the solution. Helsing's augmentation developed a series of restrictions on Alucard's powers. Levels of power are only to be unlocked when a situation calls for them, and it would make sense for this to be controlled entirely by Alucard's master, making him a truly leashed force. But they aren't. It's so much more complex than that. He has control over his own restriction. He holds his own leash. So, why doesn't he just unlock his restrictions whenever he wants? Because he wants to be tame. Why would an unholy monster want to be tame? Well, first let's back up a bit. In this universe, we have a vampire hierarchy. At the base of it, there are ghouls. These are more like zombies than vampires, though vampires eat flesh too sometimes. But they are mindless and used as disposable foot soldiers. They are created when a vampire bites someone who is not a virgin of the opposite sex, and the vampire has complete control over their actions. Then, we have the artificial vampires. They don't have the benefit of Lovecraftian horror powers and can't make new vampires. The main plot of both animations revolves around bad guys creating artificial vampires for the sake of taking over the world. These are people who choose to be vampires, and they are willfully evil. They possess humanity's greed for immortality and lust for power and world domination. 'Cause when a vampire's your good guy, you need a bad guy, and what's more evil than amoral monsters who kill for fun and sport? Literal Nazis. And then we have the true vampires. They're exponentially more powerful regardless of their age, and they're just not human. They don't have interest in human affairs. Taking over the world means nothing to them. They exist to destroy and consume, not control. Unless they work for the Helsing organization, then they exist to obey. So Alucard is a true vampire, and he's been one for 500 years. It's not stated he was the first, but he is the most powerful. He became one after losing all of his everything as Vlad Tepes by just deciding to and licking some blood off the floor. Part of his power is that he retains in his being the soul of every person he consumes, and since he has within him all of his army and enemies from his life as Vlad, it's a bit foggy when his vampire nature kicked in. The main theme of his long existence is what it means to be a monster. As Vlad, he was a monster who slaughtered his own people for what he hoped would be a greater victory. 400 years later, as Dracula, he was a monster who terrorized London and victimized Mina. And since then, when he's not being kept chained up in the basement, he's been a monster who kills worse monsters for Helsing. Kills them in the most sadistic and monstrous ways possible. Though this technically makes him a good guy, he is no humanitarian. He doesn't care about humans at all. Except for Saris that one time. Oh, look, she's in a cocoon. Metamorphosis symbolism. When Helsing is attacked, he casually lets all of his human co-workers die while he sits around waiting for a good fight. He could have saved them all, but he don't care. He don't give a shit. And he doesn't kill the monsters for Helsing for any kind of noble reasons. He does it because he loves battle. Being so powerful, he's bored when there's so little to challenge his strength. This is why he draws out the fights and goads his enemies. He's thrilled whenever he faces an opponent he feels is worthy of him, and then always ultimately disappointed when he beats them. One might almost suspect he wants to be beaten, and he kind of does. Despite his joie de vivre, underneath it all, he yearns to be truly obliterated.
I think they cry out for death. Everything was lost. All that remains is a pale shadow wandering from battle to battle. I have come to believe, Integra, that those frightening immortals are in fact frail, sobbing children.
But Alucard does not want to be beaten by a vampire or any kind of monster. Because, you see, he is also repulsed by vampires. He has a huge superiority complex and weaker vampires are trash to him, but really it's their monstrousness that's just revolting to him in general. You see, he regrets his choice to become a monster, and when other people make that choice, it disgusts him. The only exception to this is Saris Victoria, because she made the choice out of courage and fighting spirit, not out of greed for immortality or lust for power. So Alucard wants to be tame. He wants to die. He despises his vampire nature. And yet, he is by no means your typical self-loathing vampire. In all this, he still takes true pleasure in his existence, and he loves that he loves it, and he hates that he loves it, and he's just one big red bundle of messed up without any of the cliche emo angst. Sure, he broods sometimes, but he never whines. Alucard's disgust presents his epic conundrum. He wants his existence ended, but he refuses to be destroyed by a monster.
If I am to be defeated, it must be by a human.
And yet, what human could ever stand a chance against him? The only opponent who comes close to matching him is the priest Alexander Anderson. And though at first Alucard declares him a monster and beneath him because he's an augmented human, eventually Alucard decides Anderson is enough of a true human to be worthy of defeating him. And then he is distraught when Anderson chooses to become a supernatural monster for the sake of power. Though he was once human, Alucard is so far separated from them that he doesn't understand them anymore.
You humans are incomprehensible.
But he eternally respects their humanity, even though he doesn't care about them. He cares more about showing mercy to ghouls than saving people from becoming ghouls in the first place.
These people did not become undead ghouls by choice. There's no way to cure them once they've been changed. It's for their own sake that we put them to rest as quickly as possible.
To him, it's not that life is precious, it's that monstrousness is deplorable. A fate far worse than death. Though, there is one human he cares about. And this brings us back to the influences from Coppola's film. The touchy-feely stuff, the human stuff. We can only speculate on why Alucard is loyal to the Helsing family. It's never stated whether he's forced to be or chose it himself. Maybe it's because Van Helsing was the only true human who came close to defeating him. I'm inclined to believe that Alucard joined him willingly in order to find purpose to resolve his existential crisis. If he must exist, then he might as well be doing something while he exists, right? He is a sadistic monster on the verge of insanity, but something has to keep him from falling over the brink. If he stopped being loyal to his master, what then? Flail off into the abyss? We don't know much about his relationships with previous Helsings, but his dynamic with his current master, Integra, is one of my favorite vampire-human relationships of all time. Now, I could talk at length about Integra, and all this series does, for better and worse, with strong female characters in general, but vampires.
Sir Integra Fairbrook Wingates Helsing, scion of the famed Dr. Van Helsing, and the head of the greatest family of vampire hunters in history. And she is the only authority the vampire Alucard recognizes.
Integra is 22 going on 46, and though she's technically a virginal maiden, she is nothing like Mina. Even though Coppola's film changed Mina's role from victim to OTP, the power dynamic between her and Dracula was still one of substantial imbalance. But in Integra, we have a character who is on Alucard's level in internal strength. She is so tough, and sometimes she seems almost inhuman herself, but she is shown in moments of uneasiness and vulnerability often enough that it comes across as believable that she just happens to be one of the most badass ladies her god ever created.
Run them down! Do not let any of them leave the island alive!
My master, it shall be done as you command.
And I love that there is no romance here, despite what the shippers may like to imagine. Their strict master-servant relationship of respect and boundaries and restrictions is what makes their relationship work. There's no question that Alucard admires her deeply, perhaps even loves her if he's capable of that emotion, but unlike many vampires, he is portrayed in an entirely sexless way. This isn't your Victorian metaphor of desire and repression, this is a vampire of violence and madness. Alucard doesn't want her in that classic vampire way, and this adds a level of purity to their relationship that makes it awesome. Not to say that there's anything wrong with romance or lust, but in a human vampire situation, it will always add an element of rape, just due to the power imbalance. And to have something here that is so perpetually consensual is so refreshing. We see this dynamic extended to Alucard's relationship with his fledgling Saris Victoria. Though she is a vampire, she is nowhere near on his level. She is his servant, and so the respected boundaries remain. Some people like to simplify the master-mentor aspect to say it's a father-daughter relationship, but Hirono himself says it's much more complex than that, though he never mentions the potential for romance and the nuances of the gray areas, of the levels of how their relationship deepens are so much fun to examine.
My Saris Victoria.
Alucard may be psychotic and sadistic, but he's not a sociopath. He feels and cares for these two women more than anything, arguably even more than his desire for death considering how he endures. When it comes to touchy-feely sensitive vampires, he's right up there with all the others you could name. He has all this phenomenal cosmic power, and yet he relinquishes it to Integra, repeatedly requiring her to be the one to pull his trigger.
I'm waiting for orders, my master.
There is a power imbalance here, but it's in her favor. She is the one with the ultimate control in the relationship because he's chosen to give it to her. And that right there is the crowning aspect of the appeal when it comes to a character like this. Because what's more awesome than someone so freaking badass? Having him be your badass. It's interesting that whenever Alucard talks about only a human being able to kill him, his focus is always on men. Maybe it's just a circumstantial thing, but I like to think it's because if he included women in that thought, he'd know exactly what human would be capable of ending him. And he doesn't want her to. The only person in the world more powerful than him because he let her be. The one who gives him a reason to be tame. A reason to be at all.
At your pleasure, my lady.
I am the Nevim of the Edit Nev, and if any vampires out there want to sign up to be my personal badass, I'm currently taking applications. So, this review of Hellsing was specially requested by one of my Patreon patrons. I'd been wanting to talk about Alucard for a long time, but kept putting it off for many reasons, and may have never gotten to it, so thank you to patron Uchenna for challenging me to finally bite that bullet. If you'd like to support me on Patreon, the link is in the description, or click here, and if there's something specific you would like to request me to review, I will be opening up more rewards soon, so thank you! Bleh.